The war between South and North Korea has never officially ended, but 73 years after a truce was declared, South Korea has offered to start formal negotiations with the North to officially end the war. Historically, this is a big deal. We'll get the context from our guest in South Korea in a moment and ask him, Robert Kelly, a question as important as the news itself. Why now? First, let's take a look at the map. The red line you're about to see is the Demilitarised Zone, or DMZ. It runs the width of the peninsula and was created in 1953 to stop the fighting and create a buffer between the communist North and the capitalist South. It was never designed to settle the Korean conflict itself. 73 years later, Seoul and Pyongyang haven't signed a peace treaty and the uneasy armistice remains. So with that as the backdrop to this topic, here is the South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, the man who is aiming to take this very tense relationship in a new direction.
We will embark on a journey to end the war and transform the Korean peninsula's unstable armistice system into a peace regime. Let us set aside mutual threats towards one another and begin discussions among the parties concerned to end this long-running war. Through this, effective measures to halt the advancement of the North's nuclear program can also be discussed.
So is Kim Jong Un going to take the olive branch or continue to leverage its relationship with Russia, having become a nuclear-capable nation, one with growing power in the region and the world? Let's ask Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations in Busan, South Korea. Robert, great to talk to you. South Korea's president proposing talks with its northern neighbour on officially ending the war between the two. Is this a moment of genuine significance, as it seems?
Well, unless this administration has something up its sleeve that previous ones did not, to be honest, no. This is something that left liberal administrations, progressive administrations in Korea, the left holds the presidency here now. This is something that they really want. This is something we've heard from previous liberal and left progressive presidents in the past, this idea that we should sort of move beyond the armistice. There should be some kind of formalization of it or some greater regularization of it as sort of a regime, a peace regime or a peace treaty or something. The language is a little vague. But this is not new. And so, you know, the guy who was in there 3 or 4 years ago before the impeachment, his name was Moon Jae-in. He tried this too and it didn't work. So, you know, maybe Lee Jae-myung has something new, but we have seen this before unless, you know, some new information comes out.
Right, so something new. Looking back into the recent past, Robert, can you identify a runway to this moment? Was there a clear path to this olive branch being waved? Why is it being waved now?
Well, I think this is the big platform for the South Korean left on foreign policy issues, right? You know, on domestic issues, the South Korean left is kind of social democratic. It's things like, you know, free school lunches for kids and better funding for education and things like that. But on foreign policy, the big issue for the South Korean left is some kind of permanent reconciliation with North Korea, right? Some kind of breakthrough rather than just sort of this indefinite, unending stalemate, which you've had really now for 70 plus years, right? And whereas the South Korean conservatives tend to be pretty hawkish on North Korea, you know, anti-communist, the bad guys and stuff like that. And so the South Korean left is always looking for interesting ways to reach out. It's looking for ways to sort of try to bring North Korea in from the cold. And so this is, again, this is something you see every time they hold the presidency, right? And often it's sort of framed that the armistice is the big problem, right? The armistice means the two sides are technically still at war, and so that's what needs to be overcome. But I'm not really sure that there's any particular signal from the North that's been sent in the last year that has sort of prompted this. I think this is really a fairly common political preference from the South Korean left. There might also be sort of lurking in the background, I don't know if we're going to get to this, is the North Korea's spiraling nuclear program, right? I mean, the North Korean program is completely unchecked. It's completely unobserved. There are no inspectors, there's no camera, there's no nothing. There's no cameras, there's nothing in there. You know, we don't really know very much what they have. We don't know what they're driving towards. We don't know, I mean, we don't know a lot. And so some of this may be a move to try to get the North Koreans to come to the negotiating table where at least nuclear weapons can be brought in and discussed somewhat so we have some kind of handle on the program, because right now we really don't have any.
So with that, as part of this next question, there is a growing view in Europe that North Korea has grown in stature via its relationship with Russia, the nuclear component to this discussion. What's the view from South Korea then? Do South Koreans perceive the North to be growing in stature economically and politically speaking, and with that component, militarily speaking?
Yeah, so I think it's widely accepted now, as it is in the West too, that North Korea's relationship with Russia has been a real boon for North Korea. You know, if you're North Korea, ideally what you want is multiple patrons you can play against one another, right? The worst situation is when North Korea only has one country you can go to for aid, China or South Korea or something like that, right? But if you have multiple players, right, if you have the Russians and the Chinese both competing to sort of like offer you gifts and stuff, you can play them against one another for favors. And that's where the North Koreans have really sort of gained, I think, a lot in the last few years with the Ukraine war. And that's really made an impact here, right? Again, that might be one of the reasons for the olive branch now, the perception that North Korea's got a new sort of lease on life because the Russians are now going to help them, help bail them out, right? North Korea's economy is not self-sufficient, right? It needs external support. And in the past, that meant China. But if it now also means Russia, if you're North Korea, that's pretty great, right? Because now you have two patrons, you can play them off against each other. And that's all, for the good for North Korea, for long-term stability, for sort of forestalling the economic crisis that is always lurking below the line.
So North Koreans' growing influence, its military with nuclear rolled in there, its nefarious cyber operations, its political clout via Russia's help to veto sanctions against it, particularly these nuclear sanctions I guess we're alluding to. Has the South been forced into this position where they're having to reach out?
Yeah, I don't know if they're quite being strong on, but it's pretty close, yeah. I mean, the South Korea's security position has, I think, eroded in the last 10 years. Things have gotten worse. And a lot of that is, the big issue is because we don't know what the North Koreans have in terms of nuclear weapons. We don't know how many. We don't know what kind of missiles they're putting on. We have some, we have the vague outlines, but that's really it, right? And they keep building and building and building, and so we're not really quite sure what they're going for. We have a vague sense of their doctrine. They're very, very aggressive when they speak to us. So I think if you're South Korea, you're kind of worried. And then along come the Russians, and they throw the North Koreans a lifeline. And we don't know what the Russians are giving the North Koreans either, right? I mean, this is something that you hear a lot on the conference circuit here. Like, what exactly are the Russians giving them? Are they giving them like missile tech, re-entry tech? They're helping them build better engines. I mean, the North Koreans have all kinds of issues with their missiles, as best we can tell from their tests. And that could be the kind of stuff that the North Koreans are asking for in exchange for aid, right? And we hear these stories that like 30 or 40,000 North Koreans are now going to march into Ukraine. Oh, wow. I mean, if that's what the North Koreans are giving, you can guarantee that the North Koreans are getting nice stuff from the Russians for this. They don't just want money. They want help on the missiles and maybe even on the nukes. I don't know. It depends how desperate Putin is. We don't know what he's given up.
So the North now has Russia. What does South Korea have? Does South Korea feel that the United States is still a powerful and influential partner as it tries to negotiate a better outcome here? Do they have a role to play, a significant role still?
Yeah, that's really tricky because of the, for lack of a better word, the Trumpization of American foreign policy. Right? I mean, nobody knows what the president's going to do. He wakes up on Twitter and he says all kinds of stuff. We just don't really know. Trump is very, very unreliable. Right, he doesn't really like U.S. allies, right? You Europeans, you know that, right? And so, I think Trump has traditionally not particularly thought well of South Koreans. In his first term, he was sort of pretty snippy and unpleasant in his comments. Trump hasn't paid attention to East Asia much in this term, right? But, he's been pretty harsh with you guys, the Europeans and stuff. And so if he ever turns to U.S. allies in Asia, it's not clear to me that Trump will be any nicer to them out here. And certainly if you look at public opinion in South Korea, right, American approval has sort of fallen significantly. People still like the alliance because they realize the alliance is an important backstop, particularly the American nuclear commitment. But I mean, the opinion of the United States has fallen here as it has in many, many countries, and a lot of it is almost certainly the president. And that's one of the reasons why, again, I don't know if we have time for this either, but that's also been reflected in a growing nuclear debate here in South Korea, right? Which is that the Americans aren't reliable anymore because they want to elect somebody like Donald Trump, and so maybe we should have our own nukes. Trump just keeps signaling that he's not going to aid U.S. allies, right? I mean, everybody's watching what he's doing in NATO, and so, if you're the South Koreans, you're starting to think about a post-Trump, post-American foreign policy. What's it going to look like if the Americans aren't reliable?
Yeah, it's a really important bit of context. So we circle back to where we started then. What is the state of relations between the North and the South? We've seen loudspeakers and propaganda, trash bags in the recent past.
Right.
What are we expecting in terms of an answer from the North? Are we expecting an answer from the North?
They'll probably say no. I hate to sort of be a throw cold water on this, but they'll almost certainly say no. I mean, they gamed it the last time we tried this 4 years ago. I'm all for it. I mean, I hope that Lee Jae-myung has got something. Hopefully the president of South Korea has got something new that we can try. That would be fantastic. I mean, great if we could really have a breakthrough. But I will say that the previous left progressive president of South Korea really bent over backwards for a breakthrough with North Korea. I mean, basically gambled his entire presidency on it, and it didn't work. So I mean, unless the current president has something really new, something that's really going to sort of change this, some new spin, some new offer, some new concession, maybe it's going to pull the North Koreans out. But the North Korean position is better now than it was 5 years ago, because they can rely on the Russians, right? The Russians are giving them help in a way that wasn't there the last time we went through this. So I mean, South Korea's got a lot of obvious advantages, right? I mean, its economy is something like 25 times North Korea's economy. It could give the North Koreans a lot of aid and stuff like that if the North Koreans really came through and sort of were willing to agree to some kind of denuclearization. South Korea could give them a great deal of resources and engineering and stuff like that, reforestation. There's all kinds of ideas out there. But unless the South Korean government can find a way to sort of like break through traditional North Korean obstinance and unwillingness to budge on these core security issues, I just don't know how it's going to happen. And the North Koreans just have not negotiated with us meaningfully. They just haven't really negotiated in good faith on these kinds of questions in a long time. Yeah. So, sorry. It sounds so like gloomy, but
I think it's fine.
I'm not sure if anything has changed in the last 5 years. So.
Look, we have put a significant amount of cold water on the discussion, Robert, but I think it's due. I think the final question as we do that, and I think it's a really appropriate way to come at the topic, what would the North have to win by entering negotiations? If you look at it from their point of view and their position in the world as you've laid out really eloquently, what would the North have to win by entering negotiations right now? Do they really need a formal declaration of peace at this point?
So if you're North Korea, what you really want out of this is a whole bunch of concessions from South Korea. And this is like the big lever for you to get those concessions. And this is one of the big problems with the armistice, or sort of like the peace treaty debate, right, is that I think neither the South Koreans nor the Americans and the Japanese, those are the three big relevant parties here, none of them have really worked through and built political coalitions at home to make major concessions to North Korea to get a deal. The North Koreans are not just going to give us this treaty. They're going to ask for a lot. They're going to say they want U.S. bases in South Korea closed. They're going to say they want, like trade, really generous trade benefits. They're going to ask for a great big pile of cash. They're going to ask for sanctions rollback. I mean, the North Koreans are going to ask for a lot. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't give it to them, but we need to actually build a political coalition to get that. Because for a long time, right, we've sort of demonized North Korea, right? It's the worst country in the world. It's sort of Orwellian tyranny. All that is true. And then now we're going to go and negotiate with them. And so if you're going to do that, you've got to find a way to convince publics that have been taught for a long time that North Korea is pretty terrible. You've got to find a way to convince them that actually now we're going to make these concessions. We're going to give the North Koreans, a great big pile of cash, which they're almost certainly going to ask for, by the way, right? Yeah. And we're going to give them a rollback to sanctions. We're going to allow them to sort of trade on the luxury market again, which is something that they really want. And all of that requires a huge political effort, because you got to pull, particularly South Korean conservatives with you, who are very hawkish on North Korea. You got to pull the Americans with you on this, and the Americans are quite hawkish on North Korea too. And I just haven't seen any of the political groundwork at all laid to sell a deal. And that's the big problem, right? You can't just go on TV and say we got a deal. Remember, Trump tried that back in 2018 on Twitter. I fixed North Korea. On the phone. I mean, that didn't work at all, right? It's just talk. And so it's going to be like a lot of work, right? President Lee has got to really sell it. He's got to come up with a list of things that we can give to the North Koreans that is not going to cause a right-wing revolt here in South Korea. And I don't know if he can do that. You're going to have 40% of the country that's going to think he's a communist if he just gives stuff away. I don't know. It's a really hard sell.
Robert, it's been a very sobering experience, but I think a necessary one to break down this topic. No apologies needed. All the information is there that we need. All the context is really important too. Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations in Busan in South Korea. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So from Robert, over to you. Your turn to enter the chat, so to speak. Time for you to tell us where you think this 73-year-old real-world K-drama turns next. Is Kim Jong Un going to take the olive branch or continue to leverage his relationship with Russia as a nuclear-capable nation, one with growing power in the region and the world? Let us know.